I was a student a long time ago, and so I know sometimes you look at the reading and it's long and you quit before you start. So don't do that. It's not short on page numbers, but it's these narrow little columns. And frankly, and this is just me being honest, despite the fact that these people make decisions that will affect us for generations, the Supreme Court decisions and even the conversations, if you ever listen to the arguments before the court, not necessarily the most complicated. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. The writing is straightforward by design, but also they're the car mechanics of the law, right? So they're spelling out how all the pieces fit together. You don't have to go figure out like what Whittier 1962 is when they cite a case, all right? What I want you to look for, and this is really important because I know some people are, winding down from TikTok or whatever, but I do want you to listen because these are tips on reading, right? Which is look for what is Thomas and what is Jackson trying to say, right? Not what are their citations and how do the citations fit together. I'm a reader who likes puzzles and solving puzzles as I read, right? But that's not what these are. They're not solving puzzles. It's looking for, on what basis is Thomas concurring with the decision to abolish affirmative action in college admissions, and what is Jackson's defense of the principle or the idea of race-considered college admissions. So look for that. What I want us to do on Tuesday is have a first conversation, start our conversation with how you understand the meaning of affirmative action, like why it was necessary, why it may be necessary, what was your association with it. So that is very much along the lines of what I said last time when I had some opening questions. It's not a right-wrong question. It's I want to know sort of how you think about it, right? What comes to mind when you think affirmative action, race, hiring, admissions, right? And then we'll segue into a couple of different models for thinking about that. I will just say, just as a way of anticipating, that it's very important for us to think about, so I'll give you this to think about over the weekend, and hopefully it'll be in your mind as you prep for class next week, is there is a difference between affirmative action on the model of diversity and its value, and affirmative action on the basis of historical justice and what is due to those who were historically wronged, okay? And those are not necessarily frames for thinking about affirmative action that reconcile with one another. They may go in different directions. And if you think about, the very specific kinds of arguments for and against affirmative action in the Supreme Court, dissent and concurrence, you'll see, how different models both are and are not being addressed. Different frames for thinking about affirmative action are and are not being considered or thought about in the decision and in the discussion around it. So all that's to say, read, but also think. Read ahead of time. I always say this, read ahead of time so you have time to think about it. When you read right before class, you're trying to remember what was said. Rather than reading it, remember what was said and then start to process it a little bit, okay? And I'd meant to say this last time, although we had already started with this essay, but this is one of my things I come back to in every class about reading and viewing, if it's film class, or listening if it has music. You have to do it ahead of time to think about it because really important insights happen in that in-between space where you're doing something completely different and you're concentrating on the text itself, like reading. And we know this because what happens if you can't remember where something is? Like I couldn't find my car keys this morning. So I need to get one of those Apple ID things that tells you where it is, although it'll just tell me it's in the room with me. But I couldn't find my keys. And the person who was at my house with me, right, my spouse, was like asking me all these questions to get me to concentrate on where I might have left the keys. But I know that that's not how I will remember where the keys are. It'll be between thinking about it and not thinking about it, where this kind of wandering insight happens, right? And sure enough, I was like, very politely, stop, right? So let me calm down. Went outside, started to water some plants, and remembered that I dropped them on the couch. That's the same with reading and thinking. When you read ahead of time, right, you have those periods of thinking that's in between concentration and moving on to something else. And I really want, I want that to be a place of real insight. As I always say when you write papers for classes of mine, think about your paper, not just when you're sitting at your desk in front of your computer, but when you're like walking between classes or going to lunch or, in the shower or brushing your teeth, those moments where you're just thinking sort of passively and those real insights happen. Today I wanted to start off, I want to read, I remember I asked you last time to think about some examples that might derive from our conversation last time about the author Marcus Hunter's conceptions of the way we framed it as black logics, right? Ways of assembling and organizing information to understand or argue for something in the world, but also black time, right? The way time functions in very specific kinds of ways in these examples he gives. But I want to come back as a way of starting today to the second phrase in the title of the essay, right? Not the subtitle, but the title of the essay. We talked about time last session, and I wanted to talk about that because I think it's important it's really in some ways the fundamental sort of stream across the essay is how these times are out of sync, right? Around housing, around banks, around economic collapse, and that asynchronous time, right? In terms of black time and white time, that are at play in the background. It's really important to get that out in the open. We talked about black logics, but I want to think about this black methods, right? And in that way, I want to say something really, I can't believe I'm getting my picture taken while I'm trying to talk. It's okay. But this idea of methods, and I think this is really important, and this part of why I wanted to say this bit, is to get it out for us to think and talk about, of course, next week and today. But also because I want to read the very, very last, the conclusion to the essay, which starts on, what is that? Page 217. So I want to read through that and comment on it. But before I read it, I want to put in your head, right? Which means I want to install it directly in terms of, the way you think about and see the world. Is this idea of methods thought in its most expansive sense? One of the things that frustrates me about the way a phrase like method, or a word like method or methodology, resonates in I'll just say our culture, right? Meaning campus culture and the way people talk about methodology. I think people think like we're talking about like surveys, right? Or ways of creating graphs, right? Or alternative maps to understand demographics and voting or poverty or, any of these kinds of things. And it tends to have a very empirical resonance, a very positivistic resonance, by which I mean, I think we tend to think of methodologies as like formula, from chemistry or from mathematics, where you just plug in some data and then you get your result. And that is a huge part of what is meant by methodology, especially that's primarily the notion of methodology in social sciences, right? Psychology, economics, anthropology, did I already say sociology? Criminology? All of those, all the ologies, all the schools in BSOS, right? But if we only think of method on that level, right, we cut ourselves off from exactly what Hunter is trying to get us to see here, which is that there are other ways of thinking about methods. And what we talked about last time was the way, last time, some of the stuff that we talked about in terms of rumor and sort of community knowledge, right? Around the kinds of ways that this essay advances, right? Nobody believes what people are saying, right? Even though what they're saying attaches to some fundamental truth, right? And it takes a catastrophe to then retroactively see the wisdom of these community people, right? Everyday people. So I want to use this phrase, and it's a really tenuous phrase, so that's why I want to write it and talk about it a little bit, right? Folk knowledge. Now, I think a lot of times if you call something folk knowledge, people use that to sort of degrade or qualify a form of knowledge. Like somehow that diminishes the seriousness of knowledge if you call it folk knowledge, right? Like what happens if you have a stomach ache and you have to stay home from school? And you were my generation. Saltine crackers, 7-Up. 7-Up, because I'm white, but I think, white people I think have 7-Up. By the way, as a side note, the Price is Right, Bob Barker, who, I think most people probably don't remember as a host. Did you know that he's Sioux and grew up on the reservation?
What? Are you serious?
Yeah, I confirmed it like 1,000 times. Because I was like, we're not going to do this like pretendian where somebody claims to be indigenous, but they're not. But he never talked about it really. So anyway, things you learn when the Price is Right host dies. I had no idea.
Oh, wow.
That sort of thing, right, where you say like, saltine 7-Up and Price is Right or whatever your formula is, right, for nursing yourself back to health or others back to health. You can say, well, that's like folk knowledge, but everybody knows that, if your stomach hurts for like 3 weeks, you can't just keep going with folk knowledge, right? You got to go to a doctor. You might have an ulcer or, who knows what, right? So a lot of times we call something folk knowledge as a way of saying, oh, that's kind of sweet or kind of fun, and it's a nice kind of charming memory. But here, what Hunter is after is a different sense of folk knowledge, right? Folk knowledge in the sense that I got it from, I remember having a class in college last millennium, and it was philosophical anthropology, which is a subdiscipline of philosophy. And we were talking about folk knowledge, and I said, what's folk knowledge? And he said, knowledge that folks have. And I was like, ha ha ha, and he was like, no, really, like, that's what it means, right? I learned later that was a paraphrase of Woody Guthrie, famous folk songwriter, when somebody asked him what folk music was, and he said, music for folks. So it's knowledge that comes from everyday people, right? So everydayness, often communal and historical. And this is important to understand it in the context of this essay as communal and historical, because it's something that gets passed down across time, right? So it's not just simply that a group of people sitting in a room sort of come through conversation and their own sort of reflection to forms of knowledge, but rather the way those conversations are often pre-structured by previous conversations across generations, right? That's why a phrase like, well, that's how they get you, right? It's a phrase that somebody comes up with because it's something that has been happening across time, across generations, and across entire communities, if not entire nations, right? And so this relationship between the communal and historical coming out of the everydayness, right? What would it mean to then think about this as a method, right? Literally as a method. You want to understand something? How do you go about gaining knowledge and accumulating knowledge, competing forms of insight that then, as you think about it, you sort of figure out your relationship between, this way of talking about it and that way of talking about it and another way of talking about it. Right? What would it mean to take folk knowledge in all the ways it gets disseminated, all the ways it gets passed around and passed down and circulated, to take it as method, right? And not something that needs some other apparatus attached to it. So I will give you an example, right? Who is it did you mention Toni Morrison last time? Yeah, so Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. This stuck with me because I was like, I kind of wanted to fast forward to today's class when you said that. So if I want to understand memory, what it means to have memories, right? I think a lot of people in our current sort of cultural moment and set of values that surround accumulating knowledge would say, go to neuroscience, go to psychology. But why wouldn't we also go to literature? Because Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, is about memory. And it's about folk knowledge that comes from memory. That is, how the everydayness of Black life, right, has wisdom and insight in it about the nature of memory. That's communal and historical. That's something that comes from the past, but also from the present, and also can help us anticipate things about the future, right? In some ways, if you care about these kinds of things, this is simply an argument for the importance of the humanities, of art and literature and music, for understanding everything from memory to personhood to time to what has ultimate meaning to how the world is and how it should be, right? Because when we think about methods, again, to go back to my original point in this excursus, sort of this tangent here. When we think about method, I think we habitually think about things like surveys and graphs, right? Because we imagine these to be, quote, objective. But one of the things that comes with an obsession with social scientific methods or natural scientific methods, right? Neuroscience or psychology, for example. When we think that that is what a method is, we lose, right, folk knowledge, and that's across the board. But we also lose what is the title of this essay, right? Black Logics, Black Methods, and what we talked about last time in terms of Black time. That is that those elements of folk knowledge carry insights that are of incredible importance, right? Not competing with, but standing alongside at the same level as these other senses of method. So it's interesting to me, and I usually don't sort of have, I don't even want to call it a criticism, but sort of, you know, when I read or teach something in class, I like to push it as far as it can go and sort of affirm it unconditionally. And, you know, you can criticize it, but I'll try to give it its best case. And I think this has a best case to be made for it. But one of the things that's interesting to me is that, and this is why I want to then go to the discussion and conclusion section on 217, is the author uses literally sociological methods as the context for this discussion, when what he ultimately comes around to trying to argue for is things that don't come out of sociological methods, things that come out of various ways that folk knowledge is spread. And that means everything from rumor to folk tales to stories, you know, phrases, cliches, stereotypes, all these things that actually carry great insight with them, to things like painting, music, both popular music and sort of experimental, you know, extra pretentious music or whatever you want to call it. I hate the high-low art thing, but, you know, thing that wants to call itself high art music, things that's just everyday, right? So literature, music, rumor, family stories, communal stories, turns of phrase that date back generations. What if we started to take these things seriously as methods, right? And this is important because when we talk about something like affirmative action next week, one of the questions you get if you are advocating for affirmative action or against it, right, is prove to me that this harm exists, the harm of anti-Black racism, right? Or prove to me that it does not exist, right? And how do you go about proving these things? And I think where we go in our minds when we hear someone say, prove it, prove to me anti-Black racism exists. and you want to go to like some table about income inequality or incarceration rates or police per capita in predominantly black versus predominantly white neighborhoods. We can go to all of those things. This is not to diminish those. But it is interesting to ask yourself, why wouldn't I go to folk knowledge? Why wouldn't I go to what this essay is calling black methods? Right? The way people talk about their lives. Why do we deem that untrustworthy rather than a source of knowledge and a source of wisdom? Right? I think this is where this essay takes us, and it's going to become incredibly important when we get to affirmative action. Because I said last time, and it's not part of what we're reading, but John Roberts, right, the most important Supreme Court justice, right, Chief Justice, said we could put a date on the end of racism. I believe it was 2030. And then he sped it up because he said, actually, we've made more progress than we thought, right? So, like, how do you address these kinds of things, right? How do you say, you're wrong about that? How do you provide evidence, right? This expansive sense that this essay has around methods, I think, is really important. So, I know I'm talking a lot. I promise I won't that much longer. But I want to go back to 217. I love this. So all of you who are going to go on to become scholars, I really dream someday that somebody I taught will cite me in an article, an informal conversation. As it stands, none of my former students who are also scholars have even cited anything I've written, but that's okay. I'm not bitter at all. Forget what you know, Marcus, Professor Charles Cammix advised. Having listened in great detail to the plan to make my dissertation an investigation and revisit of Philadelphia's Black Seventh Ward immortalized in W.E.B. Du Bois's masterful The Philadelphia Negro, a Social Study. It is a masterful study. It is a dry read, but worth it. Go track it down. In real time, I understood his advice in the grounded approach. Deeply invested I was in this tradition of ethnographic practice and inquiry. Citations. Over time, however, I've come to a fuller understanding of Cammix's methodological insight and foresight. To be sure, I had at least 3 biases that could impact my approach and findings. So really the key word in that is biases, right? What does it mean to characterize something as a bias? Right? Especially when these 3 things, right, draw us into exactly what we're talking about here in terms of methods. 1, I was raised in Philadelphia. I always find that interesting that, having an intimate connection to something you're studying is somehow a bias, right? Rather than a special form of insight. Think about that, right? Because you probably hear that all the time. 2, for more than a decade, my family and I lived within the formal administrative boundaries of the neighborhood. So not just from Philadelphia, but from the actual place described in the Philadelphia Negro book. And 3, I wanted to draw attention to how the practice of ignoring Du Bois was in fact coupled with an ignorance of his findings about black people. So that's a specific thing about the field of sociology. It's funny to read that, the practice of ignoring Du Bois, it depends on what field you're in. Like my field, like Du Bois is like 90% of who everybody talks about. So I had to double check what this was about. Thus, the advice to forget, or at least tuck away, what I thought I already knew was timely and required time, practice, and mistakes to fully appreciate. Forgetting knowledge is no easy task, nor fully accomplished during the research process. Right? So what does it mean to forget? Is what forget knowledge in this case. Although I was prepared to forget about the role of whites in the development of the Black Seventh Ward, my fear of forgetting what little black history I knew about the community was an initial and major methodological and analytical roadblock. As research grew, however, and this is key, I came to find that every neighborhood, especially those occupied by people of color, like chocolate cities, it's a phrase to talk about, in terms of massive majority black cities, had their orbits and timelines indigenous to their own localized emergence, thriving, surviving, and disappearance or death. Now, the words there that really struck me when I read this was orbit and timeline, indigenous, right, to their own localities or localized emergence. So thinking about indigenous here, right, as the way that insight, like folk knowledge, everydayness, communal, grows inside small places. And small places is not to diminish, but just to say that if we're talking about, Philadelphia and the 7th Ward in Philadelphia, we're talking about a small place. We're not talking about like all big cities. We're not talking about all African-American cities, right? We're talking specifically about a place where we can then talk about this everydayness, communal, historical with this term, indigenous, right? Native to the place, right? So indigenous not here in terms of, indigenous people of the Americas or something like that, but indigenous as specific and local to the place under consideration. Goes on, between the time, I've come to find that to fully appreciate the assets of minority and marginalized communities, we must attend to how they define time among themselves and racially recalibrate the assumptions that conventional history would have us believe and use as the epistemological and ontological starting point for research on and about the urban black experience. When it says epistemological and ontological starting point, that means epistemological just meaning knowledge, like where you draw knowledge from, right? And ontology or ontological is just about the being of the place and the kinds of people, like their character, their habits, their sense of their own personhood. And then he says, the sociology available to us and the ethnography we can practice if we stop accepting the terms of history as told by the winners and the developers of the master narratives about life here and abroad. And he says sociological and ethnographic because that's his area of interest, right? And this is from sociological perspectives, right? So it's the audience question, as well as his own particular interests. But I think it's really important to ask then, what does it mean to think about, in this case, black places, that 7th Ward in Philly? What does it mean to think about black places, not from the perspective of the victors, right? Or the winners, as he puts it. And I think that perspective of the winners is really important because if we, one of the ways I think we accidentally replicate, at least in part, the perspective of the winners is understanding black life in a precarious place like the 7th Ward and its history around housing and poverty and economic collapse, when we understand it simply in terms, the meaning of the place simply in terms of what white people have done to black people. Which is not to say that that's not important. Obviously that is, right? But also what he's calling for here is what would it mean to actually look at the stories told by black people themselves, right? How do they tell a story that may be just completely different? Not opposed to, but just different, right? With a different concern, right? A different perspective, a different point or points of emphasis than what, say, framing, in terms of economics or in terms of demographic study, what movements of people, are made by economic interventions, collapses, or gentrification. Like these are all things that are done to black people by white people. That matters because that's a question of justice, right? Who did what to who will tell us a lot about who owes what to who, right? My grammar was right there. I just don't ever say the M on whom, right? Or I'm actually just never quite sure which is which. I went to really bad public schools. But if we limit our understanding of what he's here calling chocolate cities, or what's called in urban studies chocolate cities, or even just specifically the 7th Ward and Philly, if we don't understand the methodological significance of folk, what I'm calling folk knowledge, right? What he calls here black methods, right? And all the ways that opens up our relationship to, what music was produced, what kind of speeches did religious and civic leaders give, what kind of letters to the editor were written by everyday people, what stories are told across families about the time expanse of living in the 7th Ward in Philadelphia. If we don't take those things seriously, then we are effectively, and I'm making it maybe more dramatic than the author intended or than he wanted to put it in this, but we are essentially erasing black people from the experience of anti-black racism. Because we are simply looking at black people as the object of white injustice, right? White violence, right? White neglect. So that recovery of folk knowledge is not just here's something different, but it unlocks new avenues for insight that, in being new avenues for insight, actually have this absolutely critical effect of making sure that the black experience doesn't disappear from the black experience. That may sound weird, but the black experience cannot just be the story told about what white people did, right? There's also these notions of black logics, black time, black methods, Hunter is articulating here. That's part of what I want us to carry into this conversation next week about affirmative action, right? How are certain arguments from Thomas going to be about certain perspectives, logics, time, and methods, and Jackson tapping into something different? Let me pause. I know I talked for 38 minutes, probably 36, because I think I came in a couple minutes late. Let me ask you both what you think, right? You can ask me to clarify what I was talking about, which is fine. Or what you think about this, if you understand what I'm getting at here. And also, as I said, I wanted you last time to think about, like, what are examples that sort of fall along this black logic, black time, black method, right? Apart from what's given here, which is, in some ways, this is a programmatic, right? It's telling you how to, like, go out and seek things rather than giving you a set of examples. But what did you all think of, what do you all think of this insight? You had a couple days, I'm sure it's all you thought about was my lecture and discussion last week, or last Tuesday, 2 days ago.
About, like, you said Black experience can't just be the story of what Black people did. And I think it plays into the reading really well, because in the discussion, I kind of got the feeling that what he was trying to say was that, we're to think of history from a way of, like, scientific methods, like this article, this thing that someone observed and they wrote down their findings, rather than thinking of what could be historically important to the person beyond just what I think a professional is taught to see or taught to really gain from something that they're trying to, like, find understanding in. So I think the article kind of, like, creates this challenge of being like, there's more out there than just learning how to academically observe a community. There's a grander meaning to that.
No, to add on to what she said, I just came from a research design class, which basically talks about all that and more.
And I took a course last semester on Black masculinity, and our TA, she did a really nice mini, like, symposium on what her PhD or thesis was about. And she also talked about how back then the doctors that were around, nobody were questioning what they were doing to Black women, Black people, Black kids. They were just like, well, it's a doctor who's going to argue with someone who has a degree, who's going to argue with someone who has an education, when behind closed doors, they were just making matters worse. So yeah, to add on to that, always ask questions, always be open to know more about what you're reading.
for me, that's really important. I just sort of put a note. I want to talk a little bit more about it in a minute, but that idea of who is a thinker, right? Who is an intellectual? Who is a source of insight? It is amazing when we think about social problems and then we think about like our neighborhoods. We tend to like switch, right? Who's the authority, or who has knowledge? Who is an intellectual around this, right?
So personally, I grew up in a very white predominant community. So Blackness is not something that is taught, period, especially toward the white community. And I feel that history is so whitewashed. Like, for example, I was taught that George Washington had wooden teeth, but he actually had teeth from slaves. And I think that the problem is America fails to recognize and acknowledge Blackness and there's a huge difference between the communities, because the white people, they're either just blatantly ignorant or they are blissfully ignorant. So I just feel that this country really fails to teach its true history, and that is where we should start from in order to help resolve these issues, because Du Bois really paints a good picture of how the veil works between the Black community and the white community. You know, you have to pierce through the veil in order to see how it truly functions, because the Black community has a huge, they have a culture that white communities do not have, because they are close knit, because they are oppressed by the white people. And I see it every day that white communities fail to acknowledge, and they would rather just, keep it swept under the rug for the most part. I mean, you have your white activists, but it's how the media portrays these groups.
And they're just talking, right? And out of all of these come insight. But what it means then to where we turn when we think about what a problem is, right? Or whether we turn towards, a textbook, you said, the kinds of history that are taught. I mean, at this point, like we're like moving back decades sort of by the month in terms of national curricula. But even that, right, when we look to books, right, to textbooks to correct knowledge, it's interesting to think sort of beyond that textbook and what would it mean to believe communities as generators of knowledge. And that's not a leap, because everybody does that. The question is like, does one see other communities the way one sees one's own? Because here we're talking about, because anti-Black racism minor, that's what we're talking about. But, so we're talking about white and Black, Philadelphia. But, this goes for all kinds of other groups, immigrant groups, indigenous groups, different parts of the country. So even just thinking about the relationships between community knowledge and its dispersal.
And so I know we talked about folk knowledge in my Black culture in U.S. class that I took with Professor Dunbar. I took that like a couple of semesters ago. That was really interesting. So we read Levine and his book.
I have no idea who you're pointed like I'm Levine or something.
Anyway, so there's this guy, his name was like, I think
Drabinski, not Levine, sorry.
It was like Robert Levine or something like that. And he was like the first scholar, he was a white guy, but he was like the first scholar to write a book about like Black culture.
Oh, okay.
It's like a really good
yeah.
book, right? It's written from like a Black perspective and stuff, and it's very historical. So we like read that, and it was like really interesting, right? Because he's talking about how back in like the slave times, they had their own way of like communicating and passing along knowledge, and so that way of knowledge was just like it got interrupted because when people were brought over from Africa, like their whole system, their whole like communication systems and everything got interrupted. So they had to come up with like new ways, like they would communicate through songs or like they didn't really write, so it was a lot of verbal
oral traditions,
right, like oral tradition. And so like it ties into it's a long-standing oral tradition of passing along knowledge within the Black community. So like I live in Southwest Baltimore, like my partner and I, we live in Southwest Baltimore. So the way you learn about the neighborhood is from people who have lived in the neighborhood for like a really long time.
So, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
that's exactly what I'm getting at. Like, what does it mean to understand a place,
Yeah.
right? And when you say that, what does it mean then when people say, well, what's really going on is, and then it's a different methodology. And it's the really going on is what's important. Because none of this is supposed to be exclusive. It's rather a sense of widening, what unlearning or what is it, forgetting certain forms of knowledge in order to hear and see others.
Yeah, and so like in Baltimore, a lot of people don't rely, like city, so in the city, like there's a city council, and they're supposed to be like doing things to help the city, but a lot of times there's a lot of corruption, so like the money doesn't go where it needs to go, so there's a lot of community organizing. Like I have a lot of friends that are community organizers, and they do like either music events or like cultural events, or they do like my friend Easy, he does a lot like grassroots organizing, working with like unions and stuff like that to really bring people together. And then with like the issue of food insecurity in Baltimore, so there's community gardens, and there's always people pushing to create like new gardens and find like new creative ways to like provide healthy food. Because I didn't even know this, but what I learned is that so the grocery store has like really low quality produce, and I noticed that. So I was talking to someone in the neighborhood, and they were like, yeah, all the black grocery stores, they get all the low quality, they get like really low quality food, like the food that's about to expire, so that's why they're able to sell it for so cheap. And then I was like, well, that's not good, because it's just not healthy, so it's like the market, there's a lot of farmers markets, and that's like a much more viable way. It can be a little expensive sometimes, but that's a much more viable way to get your produce and your veggies and your meats and everything else, because it's like fresh. So yeah, that becomes like an integral part of the community as well. And just like trying to figure things out on
Yeah.
learning from other people in the community. So yeah.
Were you going to say something else? I thought I saw your hand. Maybe I didn't. Okay. Who else had their hand up? Oh, sorry.
So I like what you said about like how like we're like either blissfully ignorant or like willfully. The first time I heard about like critical race theory was my second semester here. So I was also the only like black girl on my cheer team. So like my junior year or something, I decided to take a knee, and I had to go through like my coach, through the athletic director, through like the principal, to like everybody, and it's like I went through all of that for them just to say like no, because it was inappropriate for me to like do that as a high school student or whatever. And I was just like, it doesn't make sense how it would be inappropriate, because like the reason was to combat like police brutality, and then there was a lot of racial incidents that were going on in my school where like non-black people would be making racial remarks and stuff like that. And it's like they chose not to understand that. Like no matter like how I was like trying to explain it to them, like I was close with a black counselor, she tried to explain it to them, my mom did, like that's what it is. And I feel like the first step is like we have to combat that, like the ignorance, like whether like I feel like they're ignorant, or some people may be ignorant because they feel offended about the past, but it's like,
You say offended?
yeah, like they feel offended like on the opposite side, but it's like, how do you think we feel?
Yeah, I mean, that I thought you said offended, and I'm glad that you did, because that's the right word, but it doesn't make sense. But it doesn't make sense, but it is real, right? And I think part of what you're getting at is, and this is sort of my bigger thing I want to put out there, right? Which is, I was sort of hinting at it there for a minute, that in some ways, what you're talking about, what other people are talking about, is just like what it would mean to believe people when they tell you an experience. Like, we've been going through this for generations, right? What would, just believing somebody about that, right? So you say you and the counselor are trying to convince, white administrators of this, right? The trying to convince is interesting because it just means that there's an assumption of non-belief, right? So part of it is just about this moment of believing. But I would say, and this is sort of where I want to push this essay in this direction, is saying that underneath, or the next step from thinking about like what it means to believe or not believe, a group of people, a community, 10 2, 3, 4 people telling both their experience and the experience across generations. But that step beyond just believing them is to understand that those ways of transmitting knowledge and the ways of retaining knowledge, right, passing it on, making it a part of how the community remembers its own history and imagines its own future, that is, and I mean this literally, and a lot of things flow from it, that is intellectual work. Right? I'm not going to write intellectual on the board because I'm really comfortably seated. So I have this thing in my back pocket. Both my front pockets have holes in them because there's these sort of cheap pants, and so this thing's going to be like my thigh if I don't. But it's intellectual work. And it's so interesting to me to it would have been probably, I often discover, at the end of a class, I should have started it with, what do you think an intellectual is? And hopefully you would describe, a sort of youngish yet old man with thick glasses. Seems really intellectual, and that's me. But some version of that would have been, right? Maybe professors, maybe scientists, whatever, right? But this expanded sense of what an intellectual is, which is not I'm expanding or Hunter or anyone is expanding. It's just recognizing the expansiveness of intellectual work. So when he talks about ethnography, right, which is talking to people and then through hearing them and comparing them to other people you've talked to, come up with a portrait of how groups, right, whether those are gendered groups or racial groups or community groups, giving it some character. That's that moment where it's like, where's the intellectual work being done? Is it being done by the one who assembles all these narratives and then tells the story of all the narratives, or are they in the narratives themselves? And I think the essay can't quite push to this point, but that's why I'm here, right? To push, he would push it in a different direction if he was teaching his own essay, right? But I want to push it in this direction of just saying, like, where do we locate the idea of intellectual work and who is an intellectual? Okay? So that now we don't think of, W.B. Du Bois as an intellectual, indisputably an intellectual. He wrote books that were 500 pages. What could be more intellectual than that, right? But what about if we thought Du Bois is an intellectual, but also Bessie Smith, who, at the sort of peak of Du Bois's career was the most famous African-American singer? Right? What if we saw Bessie Smith as an intellectual? Because she's telling us stories, right, about what it means to get on a train and move. And that's a story about misogyny, right, being able to escape a man who's violent. It's a story about escaping the South, lynching, right? Survival. It's also about sexual freedom. It's about mobility after slavery, which is, among many things, the antithesis of mobility, right? So these songs that may, on first glance just seem like, they all kind of sound the same, I will admit that. You start to listen to them and think of it as intellectual work, and it's like, here's somebody describing an entire world, what it means to live in those first generations after slavery and emancipation, right? And all of a sudden, like, the song becomes intellectual work in the very same way that Du Bois and all of his huge books are forms of intellectual work. Yeah.
Going into that in the previous conversation, I was thinking about, like, rap music, for example, right? I think people vilify it and kind of, like, I don't know if this is the word, but like you de-intellectualize it in a way where...
De-intellectualize it?
Yeah. I don't know if that's the word or not, but...
Sure.
In a way where, like, people kind of, like, push it as being the problem itself, or, like, kind of like an experience that is not, like, like, in a way, but in reality, I feel like rap itself, I know that it started as a reflection of, like, the culture of people and the beliefs and the daily life. Even now, where people don't like rap, it does reflect, like, the mindset of certain groups of people, even if they're not the, like, majority of the group of people, they are, like, a good portion of the people within the community. So I think, like,
They're capturing the meaning of a group, some group's life.
Yeah, so, like, even within the Black community, even though, like, we have more of like criminal rap now. I think it kind of does capture like the effect of a lot of things that have happened. Like even in the progression of rap, when you listen to like the older rap and how it talked about more community-based rap and more like striving to be better type rap, and then you saw as things got worse within the Black community, the topics that we dealt with was worse. So it kind of just reflects the like issues sometimes as well as the lifestyle within like the Black culture.
And I would embellish your phrase and say that it doesn't just reflect, but it reflects upon, right? So not just reflects like it's a mirror, but reflects like it's thinking, right? And also, just to add one other element, one of my favorite writers, Paul Gilroy, has a whole series of essays about mid-90s hip-hop, and he focuses on extremely like sexually explicit songs. And he's like, on the one hand, like people are like, you know, this is, and it sort of makes it like, you know, just plays into, you know, no, not plays in, but lays out all the sort of racial stereotypes and criticisms. And he says, but you know, another way of thinking about it is that these are people who are reflecting on worlds in which there is only pain and suffering. And that sexuality is the one pleasure that you can have in a world that is designed to break you and kill you before you're 20. And all of a sudden he's like, turns like, you know, I mean, I've taught these essays before, and I remember assigning the songs. I was like, am I going to get fired for like assigning this song, right? But, you know, and you give trigger warnings or something to try to protect yourself at the institution. But the point was, right, and then of course what I found was that you all listening to much more explicit stuff than this. But this, I mean, it was, for me, I found it revealing when I read it. And when I've taught that, people have been like, whoa, wait a minute, I never thought of that, right? And I never thought of that is an interesting thing because I think we don't think of it because we don't habitually take things that may seem really like crude and ratchet as intellectual work too, right? As giving witness and testimony to something very deep about the experience of profound suffering and violence. Right, and so, and you know, we'd spell out all kinds of other examples, but in that way, it's like the reflect, but also reflect upon. You and then back.
I was kind of thinking about when you brought up examples of like what the essay could be an example of. The first thought that I had was language and like dialect, specifically like AAVE versus standard written English and academia, because I'm also an English major, and so I have to deal with that all the time of like, what is proper English versus non-proper English and what is accepted. And it's like when you make AAVE something as unacceptable and invalid in academic settings, you are completely shutting out an entire culture of like writing and intellectual work because you denounce it as something that is real. And so I struggle with that a lot of being like, I'm in this place learning these things, but I also have to entirely abide by a system that is so old and decrepit and not like accurate to most of the people in the classes and their backgrounds.
I am also on the English faculty, so hello on the bridge that we share. No, I think that's interesting to think about ways, because what language does, you know, language does a lot of things. It's not just a tool, right? It's not just like trying to help us like figure out how to turn on the TV or something, right? It's about, you know, passing on information. It's about describing the world in its broadest and deepest sense. And so when groups of people have entire vocabularies for their world, and we see that as tertiary or secondary or marginal or as degenerate of some original language, right? What we lose is folk knowledge, right? That embedded in those language differences are not just language differences and different words that come from different experiences, but the way those different experiences can say something very deep about the conditions people live in and what they hope for, what they're outraged about, and what they love. That whole spectrum, right? And that's not totally separable from language. If you have a full vernacular, write an essay in it. Like I invite you to, you know? You're a Jamaican student, you want to write your essay in patois, I'll figure it out, right? Just write it and see how that changes your writing experience. I said, if you want. I taught classes where I invited students to do that probably 18 to 20 times and never had a single student do it. And sometimes I wouldn't put people on the spot because I'm not going to make them do anything. You write however you want. That was my point. But students who I knew well, and I would ask them what they thought, and they would say like, well, that wouldn't seem smart. And that's what this like different methods, this like notions of folk knowledge, everydayness, communal, historical, things, the way things grow inside small places is in language itself. And so maybe there is a language that is the only way to communicate these kinds of things. And that if you spell it out in different terms, right? So, in that way, vernaculars are not like translatable, right? Always. Sometimes they are, right? But they're often not translatable because there's something about the very particular phrasing and the particular sound of those languages that is there to communicate something in a very specific way. I'm just repeating exactly what you said. Sorry.
I like to kind of build off what both of them said, in like terms of the conversation of like hip hop and rap. Like hip hop is the creation of hip hop is in a basement of a project in the Bronx, a community of Black people like created it, and I think I did an oral history project on like the intersection between I guess Black violence and the Black experience in hip hop music. And I remember thinking about how rap became mainstream because I would say white media and white people considered it to be significant and to be considered something that they wanted to put like on radio and to spread to a mass like people. And I think that
took a long time,
yeah,
believe me. Yeah.
And there's so much pushback. Like it was just not a thing. It was a lot of work. And I think that kind of goes back to any kind of form of art, media, literature, intellect, knowledge, anything like that. When it comes to being back to racism, if a Black person creates it, it's not considered significant and it's not considered important until, say, a white voice says it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to go back to like folk knowledge, a lot of what the Black experience is sharing things and knowledge through common and casual like forms of like information passing, and they're still now not considered to be forms of intellectual purpose or intellectual significance because a white person hasn't said that they are. And I think ethnography has gotten it to being like more of a conversation, but it's still not in this point to think of. We don't automatically think of like this story I heard from someone actually is something that I could write about in a paper and quote. It's not a source in our heads because
not a source. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Like it's not a source in our head because say our professors haven't told us that that's an actual primary source, or like someone in a book hasn't said like a primary source can also be a conversation you have with someone. So.
You're in the English department. That's the way people in English deal with novels and poetry, actually, right? But the way that something like English, it would be like, well, that's just literature, or that's just culture. That's not about like real social realities. That's the trope, or that's the way of talking about it. That I think one of the things we draw from Hunter, right? So this is me drawing it, is that this is a way of actually disrespecting intellectual traditions that just don't look like what, as you said, professors tend to teach us as intellectual material, right? I teach, when I teach Caribbean theory, if you're a graduate student, you can take it in the spring. We listen to the Wailers' album Burnin'. And I think it's the single greatest, it's not my favorite necessarily, but it's the single greatest musical work in the Americas, right? It's like, and we just listen to it and then we talk about it and they're like, well, aren't you going to give us reading? And I'm like, listen to it. Listen to it shake your car or your office or your home, right? As it's talking about like burning down the police station, right? Listen to it vibrate the room when it's talking about Jah, when it's talking about, when it's chanting like Rasta wisdom. Like these are ways of communicating knowledge, right? And it's like, but the counterintuitive of like what it means to take that as a text, right? to study is really interesting to me. And I'm not like doing an aha to my students, right? What I really am doing is saying like, this is, nobody was like, hey, Peter Tosh and Bob Marley, why don't you guys go to, Oxford and do your PhD in sociology, right? They were musicians and they were poor but they had insight that was essential. And so they did it in an essay form, right? Called an album, right? It's not even an essay, it's a book with multiple essays. We can say something, in the dropout, I don't want to say the dropout person. Did you have your hand up?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was like, how do I say respectfully the dropout? Yeah.
I wanted to add on to the comment about like language, like vernacular. I did like a project a while back about like banned books, and I did mine on their Eyes Are Watching God by Zorna Kirsten, and that book is written literally all in like Southern Black vernacular from like, I think it was a little bit after slavery ended. I want to say around that time period from Florida. The whole novel was written that version, and one of the reasons why they wanted to ban that book was because of that, and also because of some of the sexual content that was in the book. But like we were just saying earlier, like that's literally a part of the Black experience and Black culture itself, and falls back into like folk knowledge and everydayness and how Black people just simply existed during that time period, how they exist today, and how they talk, and it's part of the culture. And by them trying to ban that, of course, is trying to kind of erase just the Black experience.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes. I can't believe we're back in an age of banning books, but here we are here. My sister, who doesn't like me, and I don't really like her, but nevertheless, I'm very proud of her. I have three sisters. One, we pretend to like each other. One, we really like each other. And the other, we don't like each other and are clear about that. When we don't like each other, though, she's the president of the American Library Association. And just look up Drabinski, ALA. So I get like the most gruesome stories of book banning. And they're trying to ban her too, because she said at a talk recently that she's lesbian, and she was like, as a girl, a lesbian girl, sort of trying to figure out what all this was. Like the library was an important place to like both have knowledge, but also talk to other kids who were like kind of wrestling with the same thing because it was quiet. And it's like libraries are trying to groom children, right? So, groom.
That's it.
I love the word groom. I used to just say, like on certain days of the week, I was like, everybody leave. I'm going to groom myself, right? But now groom has like become this like creepy right-wing word. It just meant shave and like, whatever. But this what it means to ban, what it means to see as intellectual is so important, because I always suspect that there's some deep understanding of wisdom and things that they want to ban, right? Including these kinds of things. That may be a way that people are communicating that other people don't understand or isn't relevant to them, and therefore it causes this deep anxiety.